Hey everyone, welcome back to Grace Note Forge. So today I'm going to be modeling this simple solitaire ring in Blender, and as per your guys' requests, I'm going to be going over step by step how I would make this ring with some real world measurements and an actual stone. So first things first, I need to take some measurements of the stone that I'm going to use. And for this design, I'm going to be using this little green CZ stone that I think will look really nice with this design. And to grab these measurements, I'm just going to use some basic digital calipers. And just for a reference, these are the main measurements that I'm trying to get. And I'm mostly interested in the diameter of the stone and also the height from the face of the stone to the point. And I'm also going to try to grab the thickness of the girdle of the stone as well. So I'm just going to set my calipers to millimeters and then zero them out. Then to grab the diameter of the stone, I'm just going to set it face down on a flat surface and then use the flat section of the calipers to measure across. And I'm making sure to kind of spin the stone around and grab a few different measurements because it's really unlikely that the stone is going to be perfectly round. So I'm just going to use the average of these measurements for my design. Then to grab the height of the stone, it's kind of hard to see, but I'm aligning the head of the stone against the inside flat section of the calipers and just trying to use some light pressure in between that and the tip to get the height. And lastly, for the girdle, I'm just holding the stone upright between the tips of my fingers and trying my best to kind of align the gap of the calipers between the flat side of the girdle. And this isn't going to be perfect, but it should be close enough for the design, and I can always make some more adjustments later when I'm actually setting the stone. And now that I have the stone measurements, the only other measurement that I'm really going to need is the ring size itself, which is really important. And that could be done with one of these cheap sets of sizing rings, and those should work just fine. Alright, now hopping back into Blender, I'm going to get started on making our ring. And I'm going to be using version 4.0, which is the current version of Blender. But I'm not going to be using any kind of special add-ons or anything for this build. Everything that I'm going to show comes pre-installed with Blender. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to go over to my Scene Properties tab over here on the right. And I'm just going to change the units from meter to millimeter, just so we can better use our measurements. So I'm also going to change the unit scale to 0.001, and I'm also going to change the grid scale by clicking up here on this drop down and then changing this scale to 0.001 as well. Alright, now this is set up for millimeters. I'm going to go ahead and delete everything in the scene. So I'm just going to select everything with A and hit X to delete. And the first thing that I want to do is bring up a curve to kind of represent the size of the ring that we're shooting for. So I'm going to hit Shift A and just bring up a curve and do a simple curve circle. And I'm going to change the radius to 9 millimeters. Which is a ring size 8. And I'm also going to change the rotation on the x-axis to 90 degrees. And one more thing that I want to do is I'm going to go over to the curve tab and just bump up this resolution so that it's not so blocky. So I'm going to turn that all the way up so this curve is nice and smooth. Now I'm going to rename this to size, just so that I don't get it confused with anything. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is bring in a stone and get it to the right measurements that we took earlier. So to do that, I'm going to go up to my preferences over here in edit, and I'm just going to search for extra objects. And you can see it comes up with the mesh category and the curves. And I'm just going to check both of these because we're going to end up using both. And you can see with that, the extra objects, if I look in my mesh and go down, I now have diamonds. So I'm going to go ahead and select Brilliant Diamond. And now I have a nice round gem that I can start adjusting. So I'm going to just change this to 16 to keep it simple, and bump up the girdle height because I know it's a little bit thicker on our stone. And then I'm just going to adjust the dimensions in our viewport. So if I go over to the item tab and look down at transform, you can see I have dimensions for the selected object. And we know ours has a diameter of 4.03. So I'm going to do that in the X and Y. And then it has a height of 2.75 millimeters. So that's about the size of the gem. I'm going to double check that the girdle is at the right thickness. So I'm going to hop into edit mode, go into side view, and with the measure tool, I'm just going to look to see if we're close. Right now it's a little big. It came in at about 0.6, so that's what we're shooting for. So I'm just going to hit 1 to go to vertice select. Hit Alt-Z to get into X-ray mode. That way I can select all of these vertices. You can also do that from this little double box up here at the right. So with select, I'm just going to grab all these on the girdle. And then scale them down on the Z by hitting S and Z just to go in the Z plane. Alright, so that's close enough for our purposes. So now I'm just going to move this up into position to get it out of the way. And I'm going to hide this for now. Alright, now I'm going to start working on the shank and shoulders of the ring. And to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A and bring in a curve arc. Now with this arc, I can bump up the radius over here in the tab. I can get it, actually want it just a little bit bigger than what it shows on our size. So I'm going to go with 10 millimeters. I'm going to change the rotation to -90. And the start and end angle, I'm going to bring this up to 90. And the start I'm going to bring up to almost at the top. And that looks pretty good right there. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is, with all these vertices selected, I'm going to go over to my modifiers and just turn on the mirror modifier. That way it is copying over to the other side for this curve. And I'm going to start getting this curve into shape. So I want this to kind of gradually swoop up, and with this point I'm going to make sure that these handles are aligned. So I'm going to right click this point and go to set handle type and change that to aligned. That just makes sure that this is nice and straight. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Now I'm just going to go back into object mode, and I'm going to make a profile shape for this curve. So to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A and select a mesh circle. So I'm going to keep this at a relatively high, I think it was a 32, that actually sounds pretty good. The radius is at 1, that should be just fine too. And from the top down view, I'm going to go into edit mode with this circle. And from the top down view, I'm just going to look at the dimensions, and I know I want it to be about 2 millimeters high and roughly 3 millimeters wide. It seems to be a pretty good size for a ring shank. Now I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to change my select tool to tweak. I'm going to turn on proportional editing up here at the top, and I'm also going to turn on my symmetry on the Y plane. That way all my movements are mirrored to the other side. So I'm just going to make the top of this profile kind of nice and round, and the bottom just a little bit more flat. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go back into object mode by hitting tab, and I'm going to readjust these. It's pretty close, but that should work just fine. So in order to use this shape as the profile for the curve that we made earlier, I first need to right click and convert this to a curve. That way, when I select our larger curve, I can go over to our curve tab, and in the geometry drop down, I'm just going to go to bevel. I'm going to select object, and then I'm going to, with the picker, just select that shape. And I'm going to fill caps. I'm also going to right click and turn on shade flat. That'll give a better representation of the geometry we're actually working with. Alright, next I want to make a kind of slight taper going from top to bottom with the shank. So I'm going to select it, go into edit mode, and by selecting this top vertice, I can hit Alt S and adjust the size of the profile. And if I scroll up with my mouse wheel while I still have proportional editing turned on, I can adjust the influence of the rest of these points as well. So I'm just going to look at it from the side and adjust it to where it's just a little bit smaller. And that looks pretty nice. And it's always a good idea to kind of keep track or double check what areas are thick and thin. So I like to use the measure tool just to kind of double check to make sure the areas in my design don't get too thin, because it can be kind of hard to judge just by eye, you know, how thick or thin these areas are going to be. And because we adjusted the size of that profile, you can see if I go into side view that it tapers off from our ring size as well. So I'm just going to fix that by dragging these points back in. And that looks pretty good. All right, now I'm going to unhide our stone. And for solitaire stone settings, I like to have them about 5 to 7 millimeters from the inside of the ring. And this is really personal preference, but it's just something that I like to do. So I'm going to go for around 5 millimeters. And just bring that up. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is start working on the setting for this gem. So to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A and bring up a curve circle. I'm going to turn the radius down and just bring up the location on the Z. And I'm just going to roughly get this in place. Now I'm going to make another profile to loft around this curve. So I'm going to hit Shift A, and for curve, I'm going to bring up a NURBS circle. I'm going to rotate that on the X 90 degrees. And I'm just going to position that in place. Now I'm going to go into edit mode, and with tweak select turned on, I'm just going to start clicking and dragging these vertices in place. And I like to toggle on and off X-ray mode just to kind of get a better view of things. So I'm going to drag this down. Kind of want a smooth transition on the bottom. A little bit of a rounded edge. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go back into object mode, and with the larger circle selected, going to go over into our tab, and then in bevel object again, I'm going to select the profile that we just made. And you can see it is not appropriately aligned. I actually think it's upside down and backwards. So to fix that, I'm going to flip the whole circle. So I'm going to rotate it by hitting R and then X to rotate it on the X plane, and I'm going to flip it 180. Now I'm going to go into edit mode, and you can see if I go into X-ray, you get a little bit of an outline of the profile we just did. So the whole thing needs to be rotated in or tilted. So I'm just going to adjust the mean tilt, and that needed to be flipped 180 degrees. So I'm also going to scale this down just a little bit to where it's intersecting. I also want to adjust that tilt just a little bit more. That looks pretty good. I'm also going to scale this in just a little bit to kind of give me more wiggle room with material. So that looks pretty good. I'm gonna right click and hit shade flat. And now with these shoulders, I'm going to again go into edit and just adjust these to where they line up just a little better. All right, I think that looks pretty good. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is make the bridge that goes underneath the stone. So to do that, I'm going to make another arc by hitting Shift A, going to curve arc. I'm going to rotate on the X 90 degrees. And I'm going to change our start and end angle. I know I want this to be at around 45 degrees and the end angle to be 135. So that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to select our first profile that we used for the shank and shoulders of the ring, and I'm just going to duplicate that by hitting Shift D, and then I'm going to move that over on the X, and I'm going to use this as the profile for the bridge. So I'm going to select that arc that we just made, and over here in our bevel objects, I'm going to do the picker and select this profile. I'm also going to fill caps. And now I just need to adjust the size to make it work. So I'm just going to scale that down. And I also need to scale down the arc itself. And that looks pretty good. The only other thing that I want to do is I want to make the center of this bridge just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to select the arc, select this center vertice, and scale that down with Alt-S. And I'm not doing anything too crazy, just a little bit I think should work fine. And I'm also going to adjust that to make sure that it works with our size. So I'm going to bring that down on the Z. And I'm going to bring these vertices down as well. Alright, that looks pretty good. Alright, now I just want to smooth out all of these, so I'm just going to select the shank and shoulders and go into my modifiers and select a subsurf modifier. And do the same for our gallery rail and the bridge. Alright, that looks pretty good. The only other thing to do is make the prongs for the stone, so I'm going to do that by hitting Shift A and going into curves and then selecting a path. That'll give a nice straight curve to start with. So I'm just going to rotate that 90 degrees to go straight up and down. And get this roughly in place. So over in the curves tab, I'm also going to go down to bevel and just turn up the depth. I'm just going to use a normal round shape for the prongs, so I'm just going to turn that up. I'm also going to turn up the resolution and fill caps like before. And I want this to be about 1 millimeter in diameter. So if I look over here in my dimensions again, I'm just going to select, hit 1 for the X and Y. And that looks pretty good. Now I can go into side view and just hit tab to go into edit mode again. And I'm going to start adjusting this prong in place. So I want it to connect to the bridge underneath. So I'm going to select this bottom vertice. I'm going to go into X-ray mode again. And I'm just going to drag and move this into place. So as far as where to have the stone kind of intersect with the prong, it's a good general rule to kind of have the gem kind of cut into about 20% of the overall prong thickness. That can change a little bit kind of depending on the prong that you're using, how many prongs and how big, but that 20% rule is always kind of a safe bet. So I'm also going to leave myself just a little bit extra on top, just because I'm going to end up cutting those later on. And that's looking pretty good. Alright, so next I'm going to copy this prong over to have 3 more of them. And I'm going to have these over on 45-degree angles on each side. So to do that, I'm going to right-click the prong and set the origin to the 3D cursor. And now from the top-down view, I'm just going to hit R to rotate, and it'll rotate around that cursor location. And you can see the rotation value up here at the top left. I'm going to rotate it -45. And just to make it easy, I'm going to use a mirror modifier and select the mirror object as the gem, and then just mirror that in the X and Y. And that looks pretty good. If I want to make further adjustments, like down here where it connects at the bridge, the easiest way to do that, if you're on a 45-degree angle like I am, I'm going to go into front-facing view by hitting 1 on the numpad, and then if I hit 4 on the numpad 3 times, it'll rotate to a 45-degree view, and it'll also keep it in orthographic view, so everything is nice and parallel. So now I can go into edit mode with the prong selected, and I can just adjust these to fit better. So I might actually scale this up just a little bit by hitting Alt S. And then adjusting the influence. And I think I might bring these points just a little closer together. Something like that, I think looks pretty nice. Alright, the last thing that I want to do, just to kind of prepare this for 3D printing, so I'm just going to right click and convert to mesh. Then I'm going to redo that subsurf modifier. And just apply that. And do the same with the bridge. And the gallery rail. Convert to mesh. And then use a subdivision. I'm going to turn that up just a little bit more and then apply it. Alright, now I'm just going to combine all of these pieces together. So I'm going to select the shank and shift select the bridge and hit Control J. Shift select the prongs, hit Control J to join, and shift select the rail and hit Control J. Now I'm going to do a quick remesh to make sure all my geometry is nice and even. And I'm going to bump the voxel size up to we'll say 0.04. Maybe 0.3. And I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And the last thing that I'm going to do is cut away kind of into this setting just to give me a good reference of where to cut using some burrs when I actually go to set this stone. So right now you can see this stone is intersecting with the prongs, but the prongs need a little bit extra cut out. So to do that, I'm going to just duplicate this stone and right click to make sure it's in the same spot. And with the copy selected, I'm going to scale it down just a little bit. It doesn't need to be much. This is just something that I do so that after casting, I end up giving myself kind of a little bit more material to cut away with burrs. I'd always rather have more material to cut away than less, just to give myself a little bit of flexibility. So now with the smaller stone, I'm going to select this as a cutting device, shift select the ring, and then use the shortcut Control Shift minus on the numpad, and that'll take a second. And that'll do just a quick Boolean operation to cut away the position of where that stone was. So now I have these marks on the prong as kind of indicators of where to cut with my burr later on. So now the final thing that I would do before sending this out for 3D printing is bump down the vertice size. So right now we're sitting at just about 1 million vertices. That's kind of dense for a slicing software. So with the ring selected, I'm just going to use a decimate modifier and bump down that ratio to about 0.25. And now that's sitting at a pretty nice vertice number of around 200,000. It seems to work pretty good for some nice detail without bogging down the slicing software. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And now this ring is ready for 3D printing, and it's at the appropriate size that we're shooting for, and also the right size for our gem. Alright, so that's it for this tutorial. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments. And I plan to go over the casting and stone setting process for this ring in the future, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.